Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abra Linha ao Vivo series. Abra Linha ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistic Association, and today I'd like to introduce Robert Hawkins. Robert Hawkins is a CV Star Fellow at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. He previously studied cognitive science at Indiana University and completed his graduate work at Stanford University. And his research spans linguistics, psychology, and machine learning using large-scale multiplayer experiment to observe naturalistic language use and formalizing theories of communication and social reasoning in computational models. The title of his lecture is From Partners to Populations, a hierarchical Bayesian account of linguistic conventions. Before we start, I'd like to thank you, Robert Hawkins, for accepting Eberlin's invitation and to say that questions and comments are very welcome in the chat. Please join me and welcome Robert Hawkins.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm just sharing my screen. My hope today is to share some big picture ideas about the way I've been thinking about language and language use. As well as give you hopefully a bit of a flavor of the way we study it and the kinds of experiments and models that we use to explore these ideas. So I'd like to start by kind of zooming out and sharing what I find so endlessly fascinating about language. Given what we're doing right now, we spend a huge amount of our lives sharing words with one another. So we constantly have these ideas and complex experiences and feelings in our own heads. And of course, the fundamental problem of communication is how we can get these ideas into other people's heads. So we're using our vocal cords like I am now. We are at our computers generating streams of text. And we're sometimes at our whiteboards sketching out diagrams and drawing maps and all other forms of symbols that are intended to be meaningful to other people. And I kind of want to highlight this diversity because I think it gives a sense of more abstractly what's so challenging about this. So one of the deepest puzzles in cognitive science is how we actually manage to understand one another using these signals, right? How do we make meaning from something that's, intrinsically not necessarily meaningless, but certainly more arbitrary than the ideas that we have. So one influential idea to this problem, going back to Claude Shannon at Bell Labs, is that communication can be thought of as a kind of coding and compression problem. So if I have a thought in my head, I just need to convert it into a signal that can be converted back into that thought in someone else's mind. So in this view, we have some extremely complicated encoding function that I'm denoting by the letter F here, that we essentially like invert and use to go back and forth between signals that are present in the external world and the internal world of our thoughts. So this is an incredibly influential view. And for this reason, I'm going to call this the classical view. And I think that it's useful to think about how this system relies on a certain set of assumptions. So that set of assumptions is that the sender and receiver have to be using something like the same conversion system between their thoughts and signals. And this is great for the kinds of engineered telecom systems that Bell Labs was worried about, where you can ensure that different terminals in different parts of the world have the same protocol. But this turns out to raise a lot of complexities for human communication and human language use. So I'd like to point out two particular complications that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. So the first is variability in the population of speakers of a language. So we've all had this experience of talking to somebody about something and then realizing that we have no idea what they're talking about. So for me, this often happens when people are talking about baseball. So in the United States, people really like baseball. And I start reading this article about it, and I start asking myself what it means to groove first inning pitches. How do you pitch around things? What does it mean to pitch around royals? Like, what kind of royals are we talking about? And what's a four-seamer? So this article is written in English, and I'm a lifelong English speaker. But that doesn't mean that I or lots of other people in the English-speaking community can understand it. So it seems like we've got a problem here where there's not just one monolithic language community, and the same is true for all kinds of slang, lingo, acronyms, technical jargon, colloquialisms, idioms, lots of other things in the kind of long tail of the language we use in our very vocabularies. And perhaps a second, even more troubling challenge for this classical view is the idea that that we live in a constantly changing or non-stationary world. So back when lexicographers were first putting together dictionaries in the 19th century, of course, there was no way they could have imagined how much we currently need to talk about Googling things on the internet or Zooming or Skyping or all these other verbs and nouns that we use in our everyday lives in the 21st century. And they definitely couldn't have imagined all these contraptions like this, which I used to see on my college campus, which we're still trying to find words for. So, this is a journalist writing about this particular invention and kind of reflecting on how everyone kind of calls it different things. It's kind of like a Segway with no handlebars. It's kind of like a skateboard. It's kind of like a scooter. The world decided to call it a hoverboard, but that doesn't quite seem right. It's maybe giving it a bit too much credit. So I think that this highlights a really important aspect of what we need language to do, right? This is kind of like a demand that we place on language by the way we use it, which is that as long as we're coming up with new ideas, right, and sharing them in talks like this, any fixed language that we write down will be outdated as soon as we try to write it down. So humans need some way to improvise. And I think it's clear from these examples that this classical view has gotten a lot of the problem right, but is kind of missing a particular aspect that makes human language use so flexible. And in my work, I've argued that these challenges can be addressed through a more adaptive view, which goes back in philosophy to people like Donald Davidson, to people like Herb Clark, which is that we need to engage in interaction in order to understand one another, and that our language changes as a result of this interaction. So I kind of would like to walk you through a very kind of basic diagram of how I think about this adaptive view. So when we start out talking to a new person, a complete stranger, we make some guesses about what words will be understandable to them. if we're in Brazil, we may assume that there's a basic core of Portuguese that our partner may understand and start talking to them with that in mind. If you're in the United States, you might assume some degree of core of English. But there's kind of this idea of a best guess, right? That we don't know exactly ahead of time what will be meaningful to our partner. We just kind of have to start somewhere. And this is denoted in kind of vague mathematical terminology by now it's not just a regular function f, it's what we can think of as a parameterized function f. So f is now something that's determined by this parameter that we can call phi, which is indexed by some time, right? So like at the beginning of an interaction with my partner. And this guess may not be so good. And we can find out when we get feedback from our partner. So if I'm talking to someone and they look confused, that tells me something about what things are meaningful to them. And I may shift what I say, or they may ask me questions, and that may further refine. So I may figure out that, if you're talking about linguistics with someone, as I'm sure you've observed through previous talks in this series, there's a lot of jargon that gets thrown around, right? So often we have to stop and be like, okay, this jargon that I'm using is not as meaningful to my partner as I might have thought it would have been. Or maybe they use different lingo because they're in a different community. I need to update my beliefs about my partner in order to be more accurate. Okay, so this is kind of a very big picture view, which I think you can summarize by a punchline, which is that we're constantly learning language, right? We don't stop learning language as children and then just use it monolithically the rest of our lives. We're basically continuing to pick up senses of words in this kind of ad hoc way throughout our entire lives. So I've tried in my work to shed some light on these mechanisms that allow us to do this kind of continual learning with different partners about what words mean. So in the first part of this talk, I'll try to share some basic experimental work from the past few years that's tried to characterize the dynamics of this kind of convention formation, this kind of adaptation in a natural language communication task. So this is something that we can run in the lab and try to understand. And then second, I would like to extend this idea to like, often what we're talking about is actually abstractions, right? Procedures, more complex things, and share how we may not only have to adapt our language, but also adapt our concepts with our partner. So we can kind of learn at these multiple levels in collaboration. And then finally, there's a lot of structure in our social world. So I'd like to go back to this idea of there being variability, right? There's baseball fans and people that aren't baseball fans, and the way that we can use this social knowledge about the structure of our social world to determine which conventions we can use with which people. Okay, so I'd like to start out by introducing you to a simple game that we use a lot in our research that I found to be very useful for characterizing this, this kind of behavior that I'm interested in. So this is called a repeated reference paradigm. And we can present two people with these roles. So we tell one of them, hey, you're the speaker. And we tell the other one, you're the listener. And we can pair them up online. We can do this in the lab. But you give both of them a set of reference, so shapes that you might need to talk about. And here, these are borrowed from this Herb Clark and Dina Wilkes-Gibb experiments in 1986. So these are kind of interesting because you know, a speaker is cued to talk about one of these objects, but of course they don't have a lot of strong pre-existing expectations about how different people in their community talk about these kinds of things. It may be the first time they've seen this particular shape before. So we asked them to produce a description for their partner that will allow their partner to pick that object out of the set of distractors. So basically identify this one that's highlighted and be able to click that one and not the other ones. So that's why it's called a reference game. So they can produce this description, their partner sees it, their partner can respond and go back and forth, clarifying in interactive dialogue, and then eventually their partner makes a selection. So they pick one of these objects, and then they're given some feedback. So the listener gets to see whether they got it right or not, what the correct one was, and the speaker gets to see which one their partner picked. And then they move on to the next trial where a different object is the target. Now, critically, this goes on long enough, this is why it's called a repeated reference game, that each of these targets appears multiple times. Okay, so we get to see how this speaker talks about each of these objects over an extended period as they form a shared history with their partner. So this is often referred to theoretically as building common ground, because we're interested in the way that there are changes in the way they refer to these objects as they gain experience with one another. So just as a little pitch for why I really like this kind of paradigm, I think it's really ideal for studying communication in the lab because it strikes this balance of being controlled, where we've really narrowed down out of all the things we do with language, this one specific function of reference, right? So we're trying to pick out something in the world that's grounded in a specific task. But at the same time, it's quite open-ended. So people can say whatever they want, and we get this really rich natural language behavior, right? We don't give people like a selection of like, pick one of these 4 words to say. So people can kind of just use their natural language, but in this very well-controlled domain of reference. Okay, so in our recent paper, we took this paradigm, which I just absolutely loved, but needed to adapt it for a large-scale online replication. So in the classic versions of this game that were done from the 60s into the 80s, this was done in the lab. So you'd recruit maybe 10 pairs and kind of painstakingly analyze their language. But there's a limit on what you can learn from only 10 pairs. As we've learned throughout psychology, you know, you'd really like to have more extensive data to be able to apply modern analysis techniques to characterize this behavior in finer grained detail. So we took these same 12 tangram shapes that were used by Herb Clark and Dina Wilkes-Gibbs. And we recruited about 200 pairs of people over the web. And they saw each of these tangrams as targets approximately 6 times. Sorry, exactly 6 times. And we were able to elicit approximately 15,000 utterances across all of these different games. So this is an open data set, and if you're interested in working with natural language data, I highly encourage you to check it out, download it from our website. And to give you a feel right here for this data, so this is a particular target and a particular pair who started out on the first round describing it as a guy who looks like one of those wavy tube guys leaning toward the left. And you can kind of see it. they successfully communicated to their partner the identity of this target using this phrase. So now they go on, they describe some other targets, and then about 12 trials later, they come back to this target. And what do they say now? This time they just say the wavy tube guy, and their partner gets it right. And they continue doing this. So by the end of the game, they just say wavy man and perfectly communicate the identity of this target. And this is really fascinating at many levels for me, where someone who just entered the conversation at this point would really have a hard time understanding what they were talking about, right? Like under the kind of classical semantics of wavy, this figure is not wavy, right? He's not undulating. It's kind of by this metaphorical extension to these like inflatable tube things that you can see in the real world that was grounded in their history of successful communication and bidirectional feedback. So there's something really interesting going on with the way people are updating the way they describe things. But how do we approach this? Well, I don't have time to present kind of all of the analyses we did in this paper, but I'd like to share some of my favorite ones with you. So the first thing is just to kind of visualize the trajectories that different pairs are taking through the space of different descriptions they can give. We used a technique in computer science to project these utterances first into a space of utterance embeddings. So these are high dimensional vector embeddings of the semantics of words. And then we can do a dimensionality reduction technique to project these high dimensional vectors down to 2 dimensions in kind of a shared space. So this allows us to examine the relationship between the first and final utterances produced by many different pairs. So each of these arrows is kind of connecting the embedding of the first utterance a pair said and the final utterance that same pair said. So this one, for example, started out saying a person raising their arms up like a choir singer and ended by just saying choir singer. So when we look at all of these different trajectories, there's a couple of things that pop out here. First, there is a huge amount of variability, right? So lots of different solutions are possible. This is part of theoretically what makes us call something a convention. So the definition of a convention traditionally is a arbitrary but stable solution to a recurring coordination problem. So the arbitrariness aspect is the fact that there are many different equilibria in this space, right? So all of these pairs are successfully communicating using very different descriptions. So there's not sort of like a single holy grail optimal description for this particular object. Second, they're quite stable. So once people settle on a description, they tend to stick with it. They don't kind of keep jumping around the space to different descriptions. We can look at each of those in finer detail in our paper. But I think that this kind of captures this idea that people really are coordinating on these conventions. So a couple other, just 2 other phenomena here that I'd like to kind of highlight is first that these utterances are getting more efficient. So people are able to get away with a lot fewer words per tangram than they did at the beginning. And this is important from a kind of information theoretic view, right? If you know much about Claude Shannon, there's this idea of the kind of channel capacity of communication, right? Like how many words does it take? How much information do I need to give in order to convey a certain meaning? And what this shows is that with history, you're able to convey the same meaning much more efficiently. And second, you may think that this is kind of just people getting lazy, right? So this is kind of the simplest explanation, is that like people are getting tired of talking about these weird shapes, and they're just kind of just getting tired and not typing as much. But there's a lot of different ways that you can respond to that question. And one of them is the sensitivity to feedback. So speakers actually don't shorten their utterance as much when their partner is incorrect. So if I say something and you don't know what I'm talking about, I may actually like add words or use a similar length utterance in order to successfully convey something to you. But once we have a successful interaction under our belts, then I can start getting away with shorter utterances. Okay, so I'd love to talk more about this data, but I'd like to move on now to kind of revisiting the thing that these utterances are referring to. So this is a reference game, and the referents of the game, the things that you're referring to, are these objects, right? So just 12 distinct shapes. But many of the things we talk about are not just shapes, right? They're not just individual objects in the world, like, you know, this computer mouse or something. They're things like procedures, right? They're instructions for stuff. They're more complex, abstract concepts. So how does that work? How do people manage to ground conventions in these more complex kinds of objects? So to motivate this, I'd like you to imagine that you're in a kitchen with a friend, preparing a meal together. And if your friend is a novice to cooking, think about how you might get them to cook the thing you want them to. So you may have to spell out each step of a recipe in painstaking detail, right? So this is the movie Ratatouille, one of my favorite Pixar movies. And this is Remy the rat. And he had to really drive home how to cook to his human partner, Linguini, which is the name of the human. But a hallmark of human collaboration is this ability to gradually leverage small amounts of experience with one another to chunk together things into what we might call an abstraction. So in this case, once Linguini, the boy, understands the procedure of making a roux, he no longer needs these step-by-step instructions. Remy can just say the word roux, and this entire process can unfold in Linguini's mind. So we're really interested in how people achieve this feat. You know, collaboration can be really hard, and we're interested in how people get better at it. So in this recent paper, we suggested that learning to communicate about abstractions like this, as opposed to kind of simple shapes, requires coordination, not just at the level of language, basically updating your beliefs about what you can call something for your partner, but also concept coordination. So we need to be able to represent new abstract procedures like making a roux in terms of the same sequence of goals and sub-goals as our partner, you know, melting the butter, mixing in the flour, and so forth. And then language coordination happens on top of this. So in order to efficiently communicate about these very complex procedures, we need to coordinate our language. So mapping words onto these abstractions. So this is where kind of ad hoc convention formation or adaptation comes in at the level of language. So how do we put these two things together? To explore this idea in the lab, we began by designing a structured collaborative task. So basically extending something like our tangram repeated reference game to something where individual actions could plausibly be chunked into these abstractions over time. And then we analyzed the behavior and language jointly to understand how abstractions emerged at both of these levels. And finally, we aim to explain these behavioral results with a computational model that I'd like to kind of briefly describe at a high level, which I think really clarified our thinking about the kind of problem that humans are able to solve when they're using language with other people. All right. So how can we bring this kind of complex phenomenon into the lab? Well, we couldn't get rats to cook. We tried, but we realized that a tower assembly task captured most of the properties we wanted. Specifically, we paired up participants online for this real-time interactive task over the web. So they were assigned either the role of architect or builder. So you can kind of think of this like a speaker and a listener. And they had to work together to build a tower. And importantly, these roles were asymmetric. So the architect viewed a scene, but was unable to place blocks themselves. And the builder was given a fixed inventory of blocks that they could place, but couldn't see what they were supposed to be building. So they had to work together. Okay, so here's an example of a pair of participants taking turns in our little online game environment. So the goal of the architect was to use this chat box to give natural language instructions to their partner. So they may say something like place a red block on the left-hand side, or make a C on the left. And then the builder's goal was to use these instructions to reconstruct the target scene as accurately as possible. And both participants received feedback in the form of confetti and information at the end of the trial. Now, critically, our stimuli were hierarchically structured. So each scene contained 2 basic towers, and each of these towers consisted of 4 blocks that are kind of these little domino shapes. And we designed the trial sequence to hit each combination of towers in a random order. So for example, the first 3 trials may present the pairs like this. So you may start out with the C shape and the arch, and then the L and the C shape, and then the L and the arch. So you get all combinations of these 3 towers in different scenes. And then to examine how behavior changed as participants learned to collaborate better and adapted to one another and formed common ground, we repeated each pair of towers 4 times across these 4 blocks for a total of 12 trials. So now we have this behavioral paradigm allowing us to study how collaboration changes with experience. What do we find? Well, to get a sense of the data, again, here are some example instructions that architects sent to their partners. So I've got time on the y-axis. So the first trial is at the top, going down to the final trial on the bottom, and each column is a different pair, so a different speaker in a different game. Now, on the first trial, we found that architects tended to provide fairly similar instructions to one another, usually referring to blocks individually. So place a horizontal block on square 11. But by the middle of the interaction, this particular architect began referring to structures simply by their shape, right? So calling it, for example, a house-like structure. And by the end, they developed a concise label for each, for example, calling one of them an L. And interestingly, as you can see here, and kind of by analogy to our tangrams, we found that each pair develops pretty different shorthand by the end of the experiment. So some people might call it the C, whereas other people might call it the tall tower, and still others may have some kind of weird code shorthand that they developed on their own. Okay, so the first thing that stands out here, again, is that dyads were able to collaborate more effectively and efficiently over time. So humans were very good at this task, right? We were good at using language, reaching basically ceiling performance while relying on more concise messages. And part of the way that we think people got away with this is that they were changing the content of their messages. So we analyzed the change in proportion of different word tokens. So we found that words like block reduced in frequency substantially from the beginning round to the end round, whereas other tokens like C and L became more common in proportion. And in order to study this kind of more rigorously, we asked an independent set of raters to annotate whether each message contained words referring to a single block, to a single tower, or to a mixture of both. So block level utterances kind of dominated in the first trials, whereas these kind of tower level utterances, so where you're only referring to these high level shapes like a C, an arch, a pi, things like this, began to grow in frequency over the course of interaction. So this was really powerful evidence for us that architects shifted to these more abstract expressions as they continued interacting with their partner. Okay, so this is a really rich, exciting demonstration. I think that people are not only able to learn to chunk these new conceptual abstractions given experience, but they're actually able to coordinate on linguistic conventions to refer to these abstractions. So in a sense, this is getting at the non-stationarity part of our kind of theoretical background, right? The world is changing here. You've never been in this particular statistical environment with these particular combinations of towers before, but as the world changes underneath you, as you're presented with this new situation, you can kind of adjust your language, even though you previously didn't even have, coherence like procedural chunks for these like very task specific things. You can introduce language with these meanings that you're able to understand with your partner and communicate more effectively. Okay, so this is, I think, a real signature of what makes human collaboration and human language use so flexible. And we'd really like to explain the cognitive processes giving rise to these phenomena. So this is kind of, maybe there are two goals here. So on one hand, as a cognitive scientist, I'd like to explain what in our minds allows us to do this, right? What is actually changing in our heads that gives us this flexibility? So that this is kind of like a neuroscience and cognitive science psychology problem. Now, on the other hand, as a kind of artificial intelligence researcher, as a machine learning or natural language processing researcher, you may want to know, machines right now are not very flexible, right? They kind of freeze a certain language model in place. So what might we want to do in order to give language models more flexibility? And I think in both of these cases, there's something we can learn from one another. So this is kind of the interface that I've been very interested in, where as a cognitive scientist, you can look over here and say, let's try to make our theory more precise by trying to write it down in more quantitative, formal terms. And then from the perspective of designing systems that can interact with real humans in a flexible way, we may want to understand what people are doing. So in this last section, I'd like to share a way that we started thinking about different hypotheses about how abstraction at the kind of conceptual level within our individual minds works together with coordination. So going back to this intuition that we need to coordinate at both of these levels, our model integrates two basic modules drawing from recent breakthroughs in this modeling literature. So first, we capture the idea of forming new conceptual abstractions in a probabilistic program learning framework. We capture the idea of coordinating language with a probabilistic model of convention formation in communication. So before digging into exactly what I mean by both of those things, I think it's helpful to set up kind of a model pipeline. So this is kind of a way of saying, what is the problem that we think people are solving? What is the kind of goal of our model? So we think that people start with a raw scene input, right? They look at this screen, they get some pixels, or if you'd like, they kind of get the, they get to see which of these cells is on or off. So you get this input, which is just a visual impression. And then you need to kind of encode it in some way in your own mind, right? Not as just a bunch of raw pixels, but in terms of concepts, right? That are maybe structured in your own mind. And then you need to be able to tie those concepts to language that's also in your own mind, and then use that language to produce a message that the builder can hear and interpret in terms of their knowledge of language, and then translate back into their concepts that they can execute as some motor program in the actual world. So one way of seeing this is a way of embedding language in this kind of multimodal, kind of grounded task setting, right? It's basically language is essential for collaboration, but you're kind of embedding it within this larger system. Okay, so we can break up this pipeline in a couple ways. So first, we can observe that all of this stuff on the bottom is stuff in the builder's head, and all this stuff on the top is stuff in the architect's head. And they don't have inherent access, right? You can't, as an architect, reach across and grab something directly out of the builder's head. You only get to observe their behavior. So this is kind of a theory of mind problem, right? We can't read other people's minds, unfortunately, yet. And then the other way we can chop it up is to say, okay, what goes in each of these cells? Like, how are we representing the thing that, when we say concepts, what do we mean? And when we say language, what do we mean? So for the concepts blocks, we're going to say that each agent maintains a library of little programs that they can run, okay? And these programs are going to be in a simple kind of conceptual language, a domain-specific language that allows you to basically string together block placements and movements to the left and right, as well as learned abstractions over those primitives. So the idea here is that for basically any set of blocks, there's like a little set of steps you can take to build it, and that set of steps is this kind of program in your head. And then on the language side, we have to say that there's some actual words that you can string together into messages, and those are related in some way to your concepts. So we're going to call the thing on the left a library. So this tells us like what the concept primitives are. And the thing on the right, we're going to call a lexicon, a mapping from programs to natural language utterances. And the interesting thing about this problem is that learning happens in both of these boxes, right? So given a particular set of choices, like these are the programs I see it as, these are my mappings to language, we can run this forward. We can show the architect's agent a tower, we can turn it into programs, we can have them generate an utterance, we can have the builder agent turn it back into programs and have them run the programs, and we get a starting state and an ending state. But the point is that people don't just keep using the original thing, they're actually changing their beliefs over time. So for the purposes of this talk, because we don't have time and I wanted to keep it at a high level, I'm not going to go into the details of how that learning happens. But I recommend looking at the paper or reaching out if you'd like to discuss more. But the upside of this is that as you have this concept learning algorithm going, you're taking these little programs and trying to rewrite them in ways that that kind of capture the structure in those programs. So you may, for example, realize that there's this little fragment, like a little corner or something that appears across a lot of different scenes. And as you do that, you might pull that out as like a fragment and stick it in your library as kind of a first order concept. So when we run this model, we find that as our agents go through many different trials that our human participants saw, these little subtower fragments come online around the third trial. So you might see a little corner piece, you might see like two little vertical blocks stuck together, these kind of little tiny fragments. But around the fifth trial, you actually get entire towers coming online as kind of coherent chunks that are recovered by the model because of the recurring structure across trials. So basically this entire piece appeared multiple times, and this agent is able to pick up on the fact that there's some structure here that mirrors the underlying hierarchy that we use to generate these stimuli. Okay, so the top plot is basically showing you that the concept learning works. So our agents are kind of gradually able to learn these towers exist as kind of first order objects in their concepts library. But then the key question is whether they're able to use that to talk more efficiently about these objects. So you can run these simulations, and we obtain the same shift from block level to tower level utterances. And the story here, where you're gradually shifting, like why this agent is gradually shifting to these higher level descriptions is very interesting. So essentially, we have a agent that has two ways to talk about things once their concepts exist. So you have these bulletproof block level instructions that you can give, which will basically work every time, right? You can say, place a horizontal block at this location, and with very high probability, your partner is going to know what you mean because it's very obvious what the horizontal block means. But these tower level abstractions are a little riskier, right? So you have this thing in your head, which is like this particular collection of blocks in this particular shape, and you'd like to be able to just say, build an L. But the problem is that there's lots of different things that might be called an L, right? And will your partner know which one you're talking about? This is like an ad hoc description that's consistent with many possible things. So you have to basically weigh the pros and cons of a much more costly but reliable utterance and a very cheap but unreliable utterance. And our model essentially captures that kind of reasoning and the idea that as you obtain more feedback from your partner, that these tower level descriptions work, it becomes less risky, right? Because you've seen it work before, so it's more likely that it will work again. So essentially, this is inferring that your partner not only shares your concepts of like, oh yeah, there's a thing that's this shape, but your partner also shares your language for talking about it. So they're going to know what you mean when you say a C or an L or an arch or a house or anything like that in this domain. Okay, so that was a very high level description of this particular project. But I think the takeaway here is that part of what makes people flexible when they interact with others is the ability to learn on the fly. Okay, so we're not operating with kind of fixed monolithic models. We're updating them very rapidly in a partner-specific way. And in the final part of this talk, I have about 10 minutes left. I'd like to move to a final point, which is that these the way that we're learning is intimately related to our social beliefs and knowledge. Okay, so going back to this challenge of variability in the population of speakers, and this idea of like talking to the baseball guy, there's kind of a dilemma here, which is, when do I know if I can use this baseball lingo with a partner or not, right? So say I'm a baseball fan and I caught last night's game and I really want to talk about it with somebody, right? can I go dropping these words like swings and misses, whiff? Can I just refer to DeGrom, right? So proper names are like this, like who is DeGrom, right? So the basic theory here, coming out of decades of work in sociolinguistics, is that when we form conventions, they're indexed to social group knowledge, okay? So let me unpack what I mean by that. So one of my favorite studies by Herb Clark, and you're getting a sense that I am extremely inspired by Herb Clark and his students and collaborators. So with Ellen Isaacs in 1987, they explored this idea in a fun reference game where they had people from New York City or not from New York City, so experts in New York City or novices in New York City, talk about New York City landmarks. So they basically ran a game like our tangram game, where there's a big grid of a bunch of images, but these images are things like this tower on the right. So if you are from New York City, you would immediately recognize this as the Citigroup building, okay? Which I guess is called something else now. And you would just be able to say, hey, this target is the Citigroup building. And your partner would just know what you mean. But if you're a novice, this just looks like any other skyscraper, right? You don't know a specific name for it. You've never been to New York City. So the way that experts talk to experts and the way that novices talk to novices and vice versa creates this very interesting pattern where experts will start out trying to use their specialized conventions to talk about things, very rapidly find out that their partner doesn't know what they're talking about, and shift their language in order to accommodate that. So our question is not only how do we use this social group information, where essentially the idea is that you're very rapidly inferring whether your partner knows about New York City conventions or not, right? New York City lingo, New York City colloquialisms. You're basically making a social inference, right? Based on talking to a partner for a very short amount of time, what social group is this partner in? Are they a New Yorker or are they not a New Yorker? So we were interested in asking not only this, but how does this form in the first place? How do conventions get indexed to social group knowledge? So we ran a experiment in the lab using what's known as a minimal group paradigm. So we recruited participants on the web, groups of 4 at once, connected them up and told them that they were either in the blue community or the red community, randomly assigned to one of these color groups. And then they played a game very much like the one that we discussed in the first part of this talk with these tangram shapes, but they did it with each of their partners in turn. Okay, so they're in this little network and they talked to their first partner for a while, formed some ways of talking about the wavy guy, and then they switch partners. Okay, so they're basically forming conventions with each partner, but also as a network as a whole, we can ask to what extent are they forming conventions as a network. So as they encounter a new partner later on in this game, are they more or less willing to extend conventions they formed with previous partners to their new partner? Okay, so if that logic makes sense within the network, then our critical manipulation was this social group manipulation. So we asked in a post-test phase, how would you describe this for someone in your own group that you just haven't met yet, or someone in the other group, right? One of those red people. And the question was whether people would use different language for these different strangers, right? So a stranger in my own group or a stranger in the other group. And the prediction of our model was that you'd be more willing to extend conventions formed within a group to your own group rather than across groups. There's a lot that I can take you through in our data. So we found that people rapidly adapted to individual partners, gradually learned conventions across their group, reflected in the fact that they shortened their utterances, even their initial utterances, with further partners. And then we could analyze the difference across the descriptions produced for people in their own group and the other group. And we found that people used significantly longer utterances for people in the other group that were more similar to the early descriptions as opposed to the later descriptions. So this is consistent with an effect where you, by the end of your game, converge on certain utterances that you extend to people in your own group, but you're kind of like relying on your priors, your earlier descriptions for people in the other group. So one way to interpret this is a kind of code switching, right? So you're able to represent when a kind of the limits of generalizability of a new convention. So if you learn some new terminology, you may not assume that people outside your community know it unless you have explicit evidence that they do. Okay, so just to wrap up, I wanted to give you a couple punchlines. So broadly, what I've hoped to convince you of is this big picture idea that learning is at the heart of language use. So we don't just freeze our language and then use it in different circumstances. We're always learning language. So the senses of different words are different in many different contexts with many different partners. And we need to figure out not only how different partners use language, but abstract that away to these other levels of social group membership. So we need to figure out, okay, these are words I can use with linguists, right? These are words I can use with economists. These are words that I can use with my family, who in my case happens to not be linguists or economists. So this paints a picture, I think, of the way that the cognitive processes in our own individual minds, right? Theory of mind, learning, inference, social group reasoning, all the good stuff that we study in kind of the cognitive sciences, traditionally speaking, kind of percolates its way up to explaining things about bigger groups. So there's this stuff in my head that influences the way I talk with you as a dyadic partner. When we have lots of different dyads on a little community, that gives rise to more abstract community level expectations. And as we embed our community in other partially overlapping communities in our social membership, this leads to a really rich tapestry of beliefs about how conventions work with different people and expectations about different partners. And we're constantly using feedback to adjust these beliefs over time. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators on a lot of this work. And there's many more that I don't have a chance to fit their faces on this slide. And yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas, these experiments, and please feel free to reach out. And I'd love to discuss further. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this excellent talk and for your collaboration with the series Abralinha ao Vivo. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to continue watching the series Abralinha ao Vivo. And Robert, would you like to say a few words before we end the transmission?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my final word, if there are no further questions, that I think that this combination of experiments, collecting lots of data on how people use language, as well as models, which I didn't get into in a lot of detail in this kind of more general audience formats, are a really good way of kind of creating our own feedback loop in terms of learning about language. And I'd love to, yeah, if you're interested in learning more about doing either of those kinds of work, I'd love to talk more. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert, once again, and thanks everyone. Until next time.